All right. Welcome, scholars of American Supernatural, to I can't remember what week we're on, but this is the Ray Bradbury week. And I titled this particular module Ray Bradbury, the father of Midwestern Gothic, the godfather of Midwestern Gothic. And you'll notice we don't have Rob or Coy on the call with us today. I'm recording on Monday just because there's a rare opportunity. We have uh, two Bradbury, not only enthusiasts, but scholars and experts. Dr. Jonathan Eller, who was my mentor when I came on here at the Bradbury Center, uh, founding director. Or co-founder of the Bradbury Center, and he was the Bradbury Center director, chancellor's professor of English, and just had a really remarkable career here at IUI. But when John was here, it was still called IUPUI. Dr. John Tibbetts is an amazing friend of the Ray Bradbury Center and is also professor emeritus and has interviewed some of the most interesting people on the planet through his long career. And so I just want to take a moment to thank both Dr. Jonathan Eller and Dr. Tibbetts for being here. John, can we start with you? What was your relationship with Ray Bradbury?
And
John
which
Eller. Sorry, it's confusing when we got two Johns.
okay,
The
okay.
good Dr. Eller. Can we start with you?
Well, my relationship started in the late '80s, and of course, my reading of Ray Bradbury started in the early '60s when I read The Golden Apples of the Sun, which the impossible story about taking fusion from the sun to give power of the sun to the earth, and free us from our dependency on fossil fuels. And that story stayed with me. I read a lot of Ray Bradbury on up through my life and career in the military. And then late in my military career, I met Ray Bradbury and hosted him at a conference that my colleagues ran at the Air Force Academy when I was on the faculty there in the late '80s. And then from that point on, I eventually, developed a friendship and uh, the ability to really write biographically about him, doing 3 volumes of biography and other books, and editing some of his books in limited press editions over time. And eventually uh, going out there the last 15 years of his life from the late '90s on and visiting, doing research, and um, uh, in many ways just getting to know the inner Ray Bradbury. And hopefully, in my books, I was able to present for him a fair picture of the things he felt were important in life, not necessarily the things that the public would assume he felt were important in life. And that was always a new adventure every time going out to visit him.
Mm, yeah. And the good Dr. Tibbetts. Would you just give us some a little bit of footing on your experience with Ray Bradbury as well?
Well, I was a small boy growing up with kids my age in the pages of Bradbury, Timothy Eliot and Douglas
Mm,
Spaulding in Homecoming and Dandelion Wine. I was the age of them. I grew up with them in the mid to late 50s. And so in 1966, while I was at the University of Kansas, I sent a drawing to Ray thanking him for being like a small boy for me. 2 weeks later, I got a package in the mail. The drawing was sent back with a wonderful inscription greeting me from Greentown and Mars, which I have kept still. But it wasn't until 1976 that I actually met him after a long correspondence at Hermosa Beach at a reading. And so that marked the beginning of actually encountering Ray at his home and at different conferences around the world, around America at least. And so I was writing and reading all of that time, and as an instructor at the University of Kansas, trying to get stories by Ray into the curriculum. And so I approached Ray in the best way, I think, both as a fan, a reader, and ultimately, heaven help me, an academic. And it's people like John Eller who are immediately, in the late Bill Twopence, who immediately became prime sources for information about Ray outside of the pages of the stories. So it's an honor to be here. And I am happily, unabashedly admitting I am a fan and enthusiast, maybe only secondly an academic.
And I would add that John's interviews with Ray and his wide circle of acquaintances was very helpful in everything I did. And any serious scholar should be aware that John took the time to talk to not only Ray, but the people like Joe Mugnani, Ray's longtime illustrator, very, very well-known book illustrator in his own right.
And I'm still astonished that so few people seem to, at the time, have interviewed Joe Mugnani. Yeah. That was around 90, I think.
Yeah, and he only lived 2 more years. I mean, what we've tried to capture here is a snapshot in the Bradbury Center here, which we founded in 2007. Bill Tuponts and I did that. That also shows his connections with a lot of famous people, internationally and nationally, as well as the publishing world people and the Hollywood people that he worked with. And most of those people are no longer here. And it's important to understand how Ray Bradbury could become one of the best known writers in this country, and to have one of the most widely published careers internationally as well, navigating the really uneven boundaries between a popular literature, popular culture, and high literary culture. A lot of the great serious figures of our world knew his work, appreciated him, and even knew him personally. And that's not bad at all for a guy who could never go to college in the 1930s when he graduated from high school.
His university was a library.
Yep.
Well said.
Yeah. So,
which makes him the patron saint of reading. Read the books.
Yeah. I think I've mentioned before in this class that when I'm not teaching classes that I absolutely love, like American Supernatural, I am directing the Ray Bradbury Center, following in Dr. Eller's footsteps. And I do want to point out, before we really get into the literature that we were looking at this week, people who come to the Ray Bradbury Center and what it is, just as a reminder to students, we are a small museum. We've recreated Ray Bradbury's basement office with entirely original artifacts. We're a large reference library and a massive single author archive. And when people come to visit, one of the first questions they've got, as they're touring our collection, is, why is all of this stuff here? And I always tell them it is Dr. Jonathan Eller and that wonderful relationship and intellectual friendship that he had with one of the most famous authors in the world, especially during the mid-20th century, is the reason that all of this is here. So John, we owe you a great debt. And of course, the good Dr. Tibbetts over the years has given us many gifts that are entirely relevant to the collection. Is helping us continue to grow our collection, which when it was last appraised was valued at $7.8 million. And you guys are absolutely essential to our work here. And I can't imagine two better minds to discuss Ray Bradbury. And so the first question I want to ask, there are some students in the class who may be experiencing Ray Bradbury for the very first time this week. And they're experiencing him through his weird tales, through his supernatural fiction. We've read The Emissary, The Lake, Homecoming, and one other that's The Scythe. So it's a supernatural fiction. Ray Bradbury did a whole lot more than just write scary stories, although this is absolutely an essential part of his most creative period, I would argue, where he's written some of his most interesting things. And I just wanted to pose the question to both of you: who is Ray Bradbury and why should we care about him?
I would like to address this to the young readers who are encountering these stories, as you said, for the first time, most especially Homecoming, which I hope will be a kind of a focus for us. Because depending upon the age of the reader, if you encounter these stories on your own, well, that's the best way. Mm-hmm. If somebody is nice enough to give you a guide like you can do for students, hopefully they'll accept that not as a mandate, but as an invitation into that world. Mm-hmm. And for heaven's sake, Homecoming, for me, still remains, if I may say so, I think one of the 4 or 5 greatest things Ray ever wrote, and maybe one of the greatest short stories I've ever had the pleasure of encountering. Homecoming is in microcosm, I think, everything that was Ray at the time and the Ray Bradbury that was to come. Because yes, it's got all the Gothic tropes, vampires and coffins and skeletons and Halloween. But at the same time, it's an intensely human document about a young boy, Timothy Elliott, who I'm reckoning is about 10, 12, 14. I'm not sure if we ever know exactly how old.
He's in that same range as the brothers in Dandelion Wine, about 10 to 13.
And the story, especially as it concludes, you realize it's about a boy coming to terms with his own mortality. And in that respect, it's very sad at the beginning. As
sure.
Timothy is told by his mother, we know that you are not one of us, but at the same time, we honor your mortality and we will visit your coffin every Halloween. And young Timothy, at the end of that talk, ascends the stairs to his room crying. As a kid, I'll never forget how devastating that was to me. This was no longer a Halloween story or a Gothic tale. This was a story about me, a young boy, roughly the age of Timothy, coming to age with his mortality. Now, I'm wondering if students at the age of 16 to 20 maybe have felt any of that themselves. John, did you share any of that exposure?
Well, yes. I mean, Ray Bradbury drew me in the early 1960s when I'm also the age of these boys, and to tie this back into what Jason is inquiring about here. Why is Ray Bradbury important? Why do we read him? Well, John just gave you a great example of that. But first of all, you have a story in The Homecoming where there's an inversion. Okay, just like Fahrenheit 451 has its inversion, right? Firemen set fires and put them out. So what kind of world are they protecting? What kind of world are they destroying? And here in the Elliott family stories, of which Homecoming is probably the best, you see a story delivered with great emotional power. Bradbury was a master when he was on, and not all of his 440 some stories are masterpieces by a long shot, but probably more of his stories are excellent quality stories than most writers of the second half of the 20th century. But when he's really on, you'll see the emotional power expressed through his characters. All the things that are fundamental to us in childhood that carry on into adulthood. The hopes, joys, loves, fears, hatreds of the child. The love of one thing, the hatred of another, the fights with siblings, and the love between siblings. All of this is encapsulated in the Elliott family, and what John is responding to and what I responded to was the fact that little Timothy, it's an inversion of the real world. Here's all this family of shape changers. Some are vampire-like, some are werewolf-like, some are bat-like, depending on what forms they take. Some can teleport their minds and take over other people's minds. But Timothy was a foundling or adopted. We don't know how Timothy came to their family when he was a baby.
Right.
That's part of the mystery of the story. But the mother and father, and to the same degree as most siblings will admit, they love him. They care for him, even though he is not like them. He doesn't like the taste of blood. He sleeps at night instead of in the daytime. And he doesn't have the powers they have, but they dearly love him. And at the end of this reunion, he's had fun with them, but he's also frustrated because he can't do everything they do. And he has to come to terms with that. But then his mother says, we'll always be there for you, son, for as long as you're with us. And then when you, unlike us, will pass away someday, we will always visit you. It's quite a story. And it was his first selection for an O. Henry short story volume in the late 40s, in 46 or 47, that particular year it was put in. And he would actually be in 2 O. Henry collections in those early years of his career, which showed how well he could navigate that world between popular culture and literary culture.
And didn't we, as young readers, first have an adolescent love for the character of Cece? Am I pronouncing it the way others might be? Cece,
yes.
The mind traveler.
Cece's awesome, and she also scare the daylights out of you too, because she has that power. And she really appears in 3 or 4, actually 5 of these stories, because Ray found someone that he could project in a way that would be delightfully terrifying. Okay, he had
Well
the
put.
ability to he had the ability to add the Bradbury twist to a story. Sometimes it would be called the Bradbury twist, where the ending is not what you thought you saw coming. His stories were edgy, especially in the first 15 years of his career, say the 40s and the first half of the 1950s. They were edgy. He could do suspense. You talk about the best suspense stories or the best American Gothic stories. Some of his stories are right up there at the top. And of course, he gives us the space age aspirations. His dreams became the dreams of most of us in America in the mid and late 20th century.
And in mentioning Cece, well, first of all, I would direct readers to a story called The April Witch, which appeared
Yeah.
later. It's not a part of Dark Carnival. It might be, along with Homecoming, my very favorite Bradbury story, where Cece becomes a kind of minister plenipotentiary of love. Is that even the right word? She assists in a young maiden's first love by means of a mind transfer. The delicacy of the story is amazing. The April Witch, check it out. But in the meantime, Cece, I think, represents Bradbury's own upbringing, because he had a beloved aunt, and his Aunt Neva, Neva. And boy, does she figure prominently in Ray's upbringing, because she was the one person in Ray's young world who truly mind melded with him, if I might apply that metaphor still. And the importance to him of his development as an imaginative person, as a person who felt that he was an outsider in his own world. She helped him accept who he was. He was not this, well, he was a sissy in the opinions of his chums, of his school friends, but it was his Aunt Neva who accepted him. And I don't know, John, would you agree that she very much is Cece in the stories?
Well, sure, she inspires Cece, and he will even put her character in a few stories. But she's to him, she's Glinda, the Good Witch of the Land of
Oh,
Oz.
good.
Neva was only about a dozen years older than he was. She was his aunt, but she was also like a big sister. And they all lived in the same 2 houses on the block. Neva lived with Ray's grandparents next door, where Ray lived with his parents and his brother Skip, really until about 1932, and then again until 1934. And Neva was very important to him. She gave him his first book that had an impact on him when he's 5 years old. She gives him Once Upon a Time, a very famous fairy tale collection, and then she gave him Poe books, and then she would read the Wizard of Oz books with him when he had whooping cough, which back in our parents' time, in our time, was a horrible illness. It's very rare today, but it puts you in bed for weeks to months. And Ray spent part of his freshman year, not his freshman year, but his first grade year, I think it was, in bed a lot of the time that autumn. And what Neva was giving him in literature was lifeblood for him.
Mm-hmm. And she
Yeah.
becomes a character that we see in many other stories, where how often do we see Ray as a young person relating to an older person? Well, Neva may have been not that much older than him, but in story after story, Ray, and in Dandelion Wine, writes about people who seek out and encounter older, more mature people, as if they will find in them the encouragement and the prophecy of who they can become as people in this world. It's an interesting thing that it also appears in many of his stories. I'm thinking of The Invisible Boy. Do you want to talk about that at all?
No, you go.
Well, the students haven't read that. Let's not go too far afoot here.
Okay.
What I'm trying to do is start with the broad and then move to the specifics. So, and I think you both have given us a good footing on who Ray Bradbury is. He was a fierce defender of First Amendment rights. He was constantly standing up to censors and other bullies. And he was a huge defender of public libraries. Knowledge should be free and accessible to everyone. He was a champion for literacy and the written word, and he was a space age visionary. He knew all the astronauts. He had this amazing career in Hollywood,
and the champion
where he worked on films and so on and so forth. But for the purpose of this class, we're looking at his contributions to the American supernatural imagination. And I'm wondering if you guys can speak to that. At this point, we've read Hawthorne, Young Goodman Brown. We've read Edgar Allan Poe and Washington Irving and Edith Wharton. And we've even taken a cursory glance at the Pulp Fiction era, which is, Bradbury was a Pulp Fiction writer when he was writing most of the stories that the students have encountered this week. Can you speak to his influence on the broad cultural American supernatural imagination?
Well, the fact that Ray moves from the weird tale world into a different world of a more sophisticated magazine world where he can achieve a greater circulation of his work, and I might say a greater respect for himself as a writer. So by straddling both worlds and combining both worlds in effect in his stories, and Homecoming again is a great example, he is reaching out to essentially not only a wider audience, but to his own acceptance as a creative writer. That's a kind of an interesting journey that he's taking before he's even 30 years old.
Mm. Well, and in the American Gothic tradition, he's highly regarded by a couple of generations of the writers in those fields. If Edgar Allan Poe took the supernatural tale out of the castles and forests of Europe and brought it into cities, say, and like Paris or New York, where his characters live. Ray Bradbury is appreciated actually pretty much all the way back to the middle of the 20th century for his ability to take horror and supernatural fiction and bring it to the small towns, the suburbs. Okay. And, there's a lot of writers that find that inspiring in them, from Stephen King to Peter Straub to Clive Barker to R.L. Stine.
Yeah.
And many that we don't really have time to go into here, but he had that ability to pull you along with this edginess that we talk about, and to focus in on highly emotional characters involved in a dynamic moment in their lives. Sometimes these are just one evening or one day, one afternoon, one crucial meeting with another person. And he could pull that off in a 5,000-word story in an afternoon. His writing process was based largely on his belief in his own subconscious powers. He didn't see them coming. He never knew when they were going to come. But whenever the old subcon, as he called it, would cause the story to well up, whenever some visual or oral association gave him an idea and that story would well up, he had to write it quickly as it wells up, without any judgmental sense, without any self-consciousness, without any rationality. And he had to get that story out as fast as he could. There would be time enough to be rational and self-conscious about editing the story. But his stories are these emotional bursts that have structure, which is a hard thing to do. And these little things would come out. One of his editors, Nancy Nicholas, who was his editor at Knopf for a number of years, would say that he just had this gift of being able to create these stories like beautiful little eggs that would just open out into a story that would capture your mind and your imagination.
And in many respects, they are poems. I think the prose style, which we haven't really emphasized yet, Ray's prose style is really amazing, metaphor laden as they are. I don't know, John, if you've run across any connections between him and Thomas Wolfe.
Oh, yeah.
But the kind of rich prose that we see in Wolfe, certainly we see in Ray. And the fact that Ray wrote poetry himself, many volumes throughout the course of his life, I think reinforces the idea that he's essentially a poet.
Well, but he was most successful as what was called a prose poet. All right. Mm-hmm. So that a lot of the British major literary figures discovered Ray really before the Americans did, because a lot of them were living in Hollywood as expatriates, like Aldous Huxley, for instance, and they would call him a prose poet. And Bill Nolan would call him, another writer, genre writer, and a good friend of Ray's, would call him a prose poet for the space age. But Ray wrote, from midlife on, he wrote verse. He wrote very skillful verse that, again, tapped emotional wells in his own imagination. But his poetry really comes forth in his prose, where it's very metaphor rich, lyrical prose from a guy who could never even go to college. And the words that he brings together in his sentences, he fashions words and vocabulary in ways that you can't mistake a Ray Bradbury story for anybody else. He said to me once, you can't teach metaphor. It's a God-given thing. It's mysterious. You don't know where it comes from. He said, if you try to write the great American novel, you will always fail. He never intended to write a novel like Fahrenheit that would last forever. He just liked the idea and he wrote it. And he just simply loved it, that people love that idea too.
Now, I don't know if I'm being in any way controversial here, but it's the very nature of that metaphor-laden prose that sometimes is a stumbling block for those who would adapt him to a video or cinematic medium. I mean, in a story like Kaleidoscope, when the rocket ship is split in half, I think it's by an asteroid, Ray describes it as the spacemen exploding like jackstraws from the rocket. Well, what do you do with that on film?
And what generation now today even knows what a jackstraw is?
There is that.
Yeah.
But how do you realize in a concrete visual term a lot of the metaphors that Ray realizes? And he grappled with this himself in the Ray Bradbury Theater. It's interesting to study those scripts because there he is trying to wrestle his metaphors to the ground, so to speak, so that they can be conveyed in a more visual term. But I would submit that sometimes some of the film adaptations of Ray come across a bit of a problem with readers who they're not ready to see these metaphors quite so concretely realized. I don't know if that's a problem or not. I think it's a great subject for scholars to work on.
Yes, he for his 65 episodes of the Ray Bradbury Theater, he was a producer on that, and he would write the scripts, and skilled hands then took those scripts and modified them for TV with his approval. But the thing to note is that everybody liked to visually imagine Ray Bradbury, whether the metaphors work for you or not. There was this tremendous fascination with what he projected. All the major graphic artists of mid and late 20th century, and even today, just get in line to get permission to adapt Bradbury to say graphic arts to comic book form. All of the actors in Hollywood, it would seem, not really, but so many of them really wanted to be in Ray Bradbury theater episodes, Academy Award-winning actors, all kinds of prominent actors, men and women of Hollywood. William Shatner did one episode of the Ray Bradbury Theater. And so there was an allure in his metaphor-rich world that attracted other artists, actors, and graphic artists. And that's something that's really hard to achieve.
One of the great might have beens in this context is the fact that Gene Kelly was so willing to adapt the kinds of stories that ultimately came later. Something Wicked This Way Comes, but it never happened. But if somebody like Kelly could have gotten the financial support, and Ray was right in there with Kelly, that would have been an amazing instance of a Hollywood producer, actor, dancer, in this case, adapting Ray's stories into what we now know as Something Wicked This Way Comes. It never happened. There's a subject to delve into as well for the scholar.
Well, and it was a money issue. You have to get backing for these productions.
Yeah.
Kelly was probably one of the best known dancers, singer, producers of mid 20th century in America, doing often impressionistic and surrealistic things, like An American in Paris, for instance. They were friends also because Ray worked in the studios too. So that's just one of these famous people, like Shatner, like Peter O'Toole, who went out of his way to make sure he could do an episode of Ray Bradbury Theater where he could play John Huston, the legendary Hollywood director, because he was always fascinated to see if he could have the complexity of a John Huston kind of world. Ray Bradbury wrote the script for John Huston's production of Moby Dick in the mid-1950s, and which was a very successful version of a very difficult book. And so he was able to draw these people in, even when his prose was never fully identifiable as genre specific. He didn't write just for the genre pulps. He didn't write just for the mainstream magazines. He wrote for Ray Bradbury. Mm-hmm. Placed him in such wide varieties of magazines, and then collected them into books. Very unusual for an author to defy genre characteristics the way he did.
And as a prophet of what we now call theme parks, especially Walt Disney World, the story of his connection with Disney Enterprises is fascinating, because there he's leaving the printed page entirely and envisioning something that we now call Spaceship Earth, for example. He always regarded himself as an advocate of corporate America. Which is interesting.
On the good side.
Yeah, on the good side.
The good side of that. And he would fight with corporate America to get sponsorship for things that would appeal to the American mind, the American heart, our sense of history. But I think we've wandered a way bit off from Jason's focus on the American Gothic and these 4 short stories that you are reading. Sorry about that.
Well, no. These Tibbetts and Eller digressions, I'm here for them. I love them, and I go off on my own all the time. I've learned well from both of you. Yeah. So I don't mind if we stray a bit.
Well, you mentioned other stories.
I'm sorry.
The Emissary,
sure.
The Scythe, the Lake, other stories that we know from the early Bradbury. Mm-hmm. I didn't know how you might want to deal with those stories in addition to Homecoming.
I'm not going to be too prescriptive. Let's just talk about them. We've got 3 of the world's leading experts on Bradbury here on the call right now.
Because the Emissary, I think, is the most purely weird tale kind of story.
Now, what do you mean by a pure weird tale, John?
Well, it's straight Gothic.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got digging up bodies, and it takes place in the autumn in October country, as it became later designated. And it's a young boy and his dog, and what the dog digs up one day from the cemetery. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you might expect to see in like Creepshow, the movie,
sure,
in a comic book.
But by doing it from the child's perspective, it has the cheapness of those kinds of films. It dissolves away. Now, when we talk about him rewriting, that was sort of the thing that fascinated Ray about what I did, was the forensics work to show all the ways he constantly rewrote. The 2 versions of the Emissary in print, and one of them, the dog has the name Tory, and the other one, he's just Dog. Okay. And now Ray never changed the overall structures and paragraph by paragraph progression of any of his stories, but he would rewrite them sometimes years later. And with the Emissary, you'd see changes if you read the version with Dog or the version with Tory, but you still get the same dog that is slowly disintegrating itself to the point where it'll give that boy everything he wants to smell the coming of autumn, right up to and including the body of his teacher, who has died while he himself has been in bed with something like whooping cough. So Ray could write about that. And Ray had a dog in those years, dog that would often run off and come back days later, a dog that he loved. He'd paddle the dog for running off, and then he'd hug the dog again. Is that kind of those emotional complexities of childhood, love, hate, need, desire, repulsion. It's all there.
Absolutely.
Now, as opposed to Emissary, the Scythe is on a more cosmic level. You're not concerned now with leaves and autumn and all of that. You're more concerned with the mortality of the world. And it's an allegory about a man's encounter with a field of ripening wheat that must be, what would be the word, harvested. And in the so-called harvesting, you have a global catastrophe. I'm reminded of the movie, the one with Frederick March, Death Takes a Holiday. Mm-hmm. Here you have a holiday. As long as the guy is not scything the wheat, mortality is suspended. and the world is descended into chaos. Mortality is important. He is mandated to continue to side that field. I mean, this is out and out allegory.
Well, and it's metaphor made real, the Grim Reaper. Okay. And Ray's writing this, remember, in the darkest days of World War II. You know, he's 23, 24 years old when he writes this story. And this Depression era family can barely make a living. They've lost their farm. They find this farmhouse with all these wheat fields around it. And you have the man who goes about the job until he sees something in the wheat that makes him stop. There's a what if here that Bradbury extends very nicely through a story that will still hold and fascinate an audience today, as old as it is. That story's 80 years old.
Now, one of the earliest, most highly praised of Ray's story, as I understand it, is The Lake. Ghost story, maybe, like all great ghost stories, you're always kind of suspended in a sort of limbo there. But The Lake is a love story. And again, yes, we have this aching kind of portrait of a young boy who is not quite aware of how it is he feels about this young girl who has drowned. And the way it works out, again, you are left with the kind of thing that Timothy is left with in Homecoming, a kind of aching sense of mortality and regret. Ray can celebrate so many things in his stories. And at times, maybe he can become a bit mawkish and sentimental. But I'll tell you, in stories like this and Homecoming, there's not a trace of it. Instead, there's an inner kind of regret, that taste of mortality that is in all of Ray's stories. And if I may, I'd like to read a passage from another story, not long from this time period, from Dandelion Wine, in which young Doug Spaulding is reminded of his own mortality. And the junk man, Mr. Jonas, is talking to him while young Doug is in his sickbed. He's had a tough summer. He's been growing up. And Mr. Jonas tells, in words to Douglas Spaulding, words that impacted on me, and I think every other reader. And here's the quote. Some people turn sad awfully young. No special reason, it seems. But they seem almost to be born that way. They bruise easier, tire faster, cry quicker, remember longer, and as I say, get sadder younger than anyone else in the world. That passage hit me like a ton of bricks as a young reader. I think it's Ray, it's the character in The Lake, it's the character in these books we're talking about. It's an inner kind of tension that I think is never very far from Ray's work.
And with The Lake in 1943, he realizes that he's written a real quality story. He always, like any writer, especially a writer coming from the humble origins that he comes from, is worried about whether he'll make it or not. Mm-hmm. This story, as he writes it, and coming back recursively to the small town in Illinois, and finding the remains of the very sandcastle that was there, that he was building with a little girl who drowned in the lake 15, 20 years earlier, and to see her finally brought up from the depths of the lake, is an amazing story with emotional power and a focus. And he knew then he was going to be doing much better with those kinds of stories if he just did it his way and didn't give the magazines ghost stories or vampire stories or werewolf stories. And from then on, his path was laid out.
Safe to say nothing quite like that had appeared in popular literature?
Well, I'd say it had appeared, but it had not been so finely crafted in a short 4,000-word story like that.
Yeah, I mean, imagine as a straight-on ghost story, it wouldn't work.
And what impresses me about The Lake is the poignance and the intuition, the wisdom that kind of comes through in this story. We're all going to experience loss in our lives. We're all going to feel the pang of losing someone we care about, and the emotional resonance that this story has, and Ray's ability to find the beauty in that sense of loss, the beauty in letting go. And, he's been gone for a decade. This young man has been gone for a decade when he comes back to where he lost his first love. And I love the way that he writes about that. It was the kind of love that was that was innocent, that came before any knowledge of body and morals. I love that phrase. And you realize as
Stop
he
you there.
returns.
I'm going to stop you with that micro pause. You're on a roll, just like Animal House, but we have guests out here and we need to probably take a pause.
Oh, okay. Okay. Sounds good. We can pick this up later.
Yeah. Right.
All right. We are back from intermission with the good Dr. Jonathan Eller and the good Dr. John Tibbetts. And I guess as we kind of put a bow on our discussion, we've learned a lot of interesting things this past hour. The title of this module is Ray Bradbury, Godfather of the Midwestern Gothic Tradition, and wanted to get your take on that title. There is a well-known Southern Gothic literary tradition. We don't often hear about the Midwest Gothic tradition. Would you say the Midwest has a unique Gothic tradition, and how would you differentiate it if it does from what we see in Southern Gothic?
Well, wouldn't we include Edgar Lee Masters?
I would say that kind of where it originates in the 20th century, Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology and Spoon River Revisited, or whatever the second book was. Yeah, the poems based on the tombstones in the town cemetery. In a way, Winesburg, Ohio,
Sherwood Anderson
is by Sherwood Anderson is a Midwest Gothic, but Ray's Midwestern Gothic is anchored in the same, what would you call it, chronotope, as Bill Tupons would often say, the same time and place as the other Gothic writers in the Midwest. That is, the small towns and the counties around them. In Ray's case, people divided by age, divided by background, divided by the ravine through the middle of the town. In early versions of some of his story drafts, you'll find that in one of them he plays a game where all the younger families live on one side of the ravine and all the old people live on the other side of the ravine. And that, I think, even that might even play through a little bit into Farewell Summer, which is the larger novel from which Dandelion Wine stories were drawn. But Farewell Summer was not published until 50 years later.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking about Thornton Wilder, too. Our Town.
Yeah.
But there's something about the works done by some of the writers we're talking about where people seem to be living a kind of blunted existence.
Yeah.
It's a half-life. Hopes unrealized.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Late in the 19th century, I believe he was from Kansas, a newspaper editor named Howe wrote a novel called Story of a Country Town. It is one of the bleakest, most nihilistic portraits of a family growing up around the Topeka, Kansas City region. There's nothing celebrating the Midwest there. Instead, it's a region that blights your existence. Now, how that fits into a Midwestern Gothic, I don't know, but it's pretty nihilistic stuff.
I see.
Well, yeah. You could also argue that the Midwestern Gothic really is everywhere. It's everywhere. There's a small town where people who never were able to fulfill their aspirations live sort of a twilight world. And I'll give you a good example of that. One of the great, I think, Gothics of the early 20th century is set in New England, and that would be Edith Wharton's short novel Ethan Frome.
Oh boy!
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Not a happy book.
No.
And it falls on you. It just falls on the reader like an avalanche in the last pages of the book.
Yeah. And when you compare it to her more fashion-conscious books that have a bite all of their own, Ethan Frome is spare and gaunt and slim of limb.
And an incredibly simple plot. But the characters, and there's only 3 characters really, make it a complicated and suspenseful story.
Yeah. And for me, Midwestern Gothic is more than a literary tradition. It's also an aesthetic as well. And Bradbury, being an amateur artist, I think his painting the Halloween tree exemplifies what we mean by that aesthetic. You know, it is October country where there's browns and burnt oranges and autumnal colors abound. Midwestern Gothic is empty cornfields after the harvest, lonely farmhouses standing amidst them. It is, as Bradbury says, it's coal bins, it's attics, it's cold, dank places that exist when the locking season comes into full force.
And the only promise you can find are those bottles of dandelion wine that are kept
Yes.
in the cellar. A
Yeah.
little bit of summer that's been preserved, but that appears to be about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Summer is the time for toil. It's when you've got the longest days, and you know, in farming communities, as somebody who was born literally on a dairy farm, you know, you work your hardest during the summers. You don't waste daylight as a farmer. Things calm down a little bit during the autumn season.
Now, among the many rituals in dandelion wine, of course, are the fire balloons. And there's an example, though, of a celebratory observation
Yes, and
about
just
light.
to give students some footing, Dandelion Wine is another Bradbury novel.
Yeah. And like Homecoming, which we've already talked about, it's about a young boy, probably about 10 to 12 years old, who finds himself, who is suddenly aware that he's aware. He no longer is just recording his boyhood. He's aware that he's recording his boyhood
Yes.
at the end of the book. It contains some of Ray's most beautiful prose. And it is a celebration in many respects of life in this Midwestern town with the family, with grandpa and grandma on the porch. In fact, that brings to mind James Agee, because James Agee's Knoxville Summer certainly fits into that picture as well. And I would love to know if there's any connections about Ray's reading of James Agee that might be opposite here. The porch swing, the summer twilights, the creak of the swing, the ticking of the locusts, the kids out on the lawn. I mean, it's just magical stuff. And then the fire balloons, yeah, the paper tissue globes that with the candle that are released into the sky. It's one of the greatest passages I know of in all of Bradbury. But guess how it ends? It ends with the fire balloons disappearing, and then the boy weeping that it's all gone. There's that sense of elegy again that I think is
Oh,
everywhere in Bradbury.
yeah. The sacred and the ephemeral are both part of Bradbury's. Um, well, he draws from them constantly. You know, John. He was Dr. Eller. Ray was very well aware of his mortality from a very young age. Can you speak to that? Because I mean, it certainly comes through in Homecoming in a big way. It also comes through in The Emissary. Um, uh, can you very briefly, just before we sign off here, talk a little bit about Bradbury's biography? What made him so interested in this constant realization that just seemed to haunt him his entire life, that at some point I'm not going to be here anymore. I'm not going to live forever. And if I am, I'm going to have to live on in the pages of the stories that I write.
Well, he and I would often talk about that young writer who became Ray Bradbury, or that young boy who became that young writer. He was fascinated by that doubling. He often would feel that if he looked out of the studio gates when he was finally, by the 1950s and early 60s, working at the studios occasionally, he felt he would still see that 12-year-old boy, well, 13-year-old boy standing out there with all the other lonely people, desperately looking for the stars to come out so he could get their autographs. And then for Dandelion Wine, again, the story it's a series of 20 odd stories that encapsulate his years growing up to age 14 in Waukegan, age 13 in Waukegan, Illinois. He wrote an interesting stage play that would get performed on through the rest of his life, where the 40-year-old adult revisits the Dandelion Wine world and meets his younger self and asks him, what about this summer made you grow? What about this summer made you grow old at such an early age? Yeah, age was fascinating to him. He had a fear of death a lot of people have talked about, gosh, when my baby sister died when I was 7, 8 years old, that when I first encountered death, and my father crying for one of only 2 times in his life that I saw him cry. Or more popularly, he would talk about how when Lon Chaney dies in 1930, his idol of the silent movies, that Bradbury worshipped him. He saw that other people could die meant he could die too. And it's in that chapter that John was referring to in Dandelion Wine. You have that Walt Whitman-esque kind of sense of living being all around him. Well, that's in the wind. And wow, I'm alive. What does that mean exactly? What should I feel? How should I be conscious of being alive as I go through the mundane tasks of everyday living?
Well, the epiphany that he suffers.
Yes. The epiphany. But then he had nightmares too, because right on up into his teenage years, when he saw Hitler experimenting in bombing in Spain at the request of General Franco, and Mussolini's Air Force, Italian Air Force, getting a chance to drop bombs, and Mussolini's son saying, "Oh, the bombs are beautiful. It looks like flower petals opening up from the aircraft." And Ray says, "This is horrible that people could talk this way about killing innocent civilians." And he was afraid that the war looming on the horizon would come, and he'd be devoured, and he'd never be a writer. And he never did go into military service. He did alternative service because he was medically disqualified because of his vision. But the last thing I'll say is, I ran across an envelope he had sent out with a circulating story, and this was in the late 40s, I think, where he said, it wrote on the back of the envelope, if I die before this letter arrives, please destroy it unopened. So he was always thinking about death just around the corner.
Now, maybe as a counter to this, if I were to ask you, what is the story of his youth that he told over and over and over again about a carnival? What is that story? It's about the magician or the hypnotist who pointed a wand at him and said what to him?
Live forever.
Live forever. I saw him give that speech many times in different venues. It rarely changed. And I've always wondered, did that really happen? How many people wondered, did that really happen? Live forever? What's going on there? Is that a fear of death?
Well, I mean, when he's getting the electric charge from this is a carnival midway performer who has, he's using static electricity to make your hair stand up and all that magical stuff. Everything is a what if with Ray Bradbury. And when he was already by that age, which would have been around 12, 13, thinking about, gosh, is it all just over when you die? Is there nothing else? And he realized that night that event forced him to realize, excuse me, that the way you live forever, if you're gifted enough to be a writer, is to let your work live forever for you. Let your art, if you're an artist, live forever for you. And that was the importance of the whole Mr. Electrico thing.
Now, in all of your own research into Bradbury, do you have any inkling whether or not that ever really happened? Now, you're going to say it probably doesn't matter, but I would love to know if there's some basis, in fact, of that encounter with Mr. Electrico.
I think it really happened. I think sometimes the details blur as he conflates this particular circumstances or dates. But then it's a storyteller's story, isn't it? It's a story of his life, and everything he would ever talk about his audiences was on some level true. But it was also enhanced a little bit, where he could make a storyteller's story live a little more vividly, because it's a natural process of mind and memory and imagination. The way I remember certain things from youth or from young adulthood are different now in my 70s. I just went through probably 1,000 or 1,500 family photographs dating back throughout my whole life. And the earliest ones I'm looking at, I'm fascinated what I'm seeing, all kinds of history, but it's not quite the way I actually remembered it, but that's real. And, the reality in my mind is slightly different. And that comes to everybody. And Ray doesn't run from that. He doesn't exploit that, but he celebrates it. And so that story's alive, even if some of the details aren't quite right.
Yeah, and there's no way to confirm whether the details are right or not. We still haven't found any confirmation of a carnival that came to Waukegan at that time, or that had a Mr. Electrical kind of sideshow attraction. But I find this really interesting. So just to kind of contextualize for students, timeline here, Bradbury loses a little sister, a sibling, when he's 7. When he's 8, there is a little girl, 8 years old, who goes into Lake Michigan and does not return. When he's 10, his silver screen idol, Lon Chaney, passes away, and he realizes, oh my God, if Lon Chaney can't escape death, how can I escape it? I'm going to die someday.
And there's that very moment in
And
Dandelion.
then you have the fictionalized version of when he realizes, oh, but I'm alive.
Yeah.
Not long afterwards, and yes, he does write about it beautifully, at the very beginning of Dandelion Wine, looking at the goosebumps on his arm and realizing, I'm living. I'm living. And then he has this encounter not long after with Mr. Electrico where he says, live forever. And he thinks, my God, how do I do that? And he realizes, I need to write every day of my life. I need to become a writer. That's how I find my immortality. And he begins writing, according to him, every day of his life for 10 years. And then one day he sits down at his typewriter and he's not imitating anybody. And he's thinking about that little girl that went into Lake Michigan and never came out. And he writes in one sitting the first draft of The Lake, which we read this week. And that story is when he realizes, my God, I've done it. I'm not writing for this magazine or that magazine. I'm not writing for the right or the left. This is something that just came from me. This is my voice, my story.
Yes. And
Yeah.
that will grow in him decade by decade through his 7-decade writing career. And he's then free of that fear because he has made it. He's made it when in the 50s he realizes he can, and in the early 60s, he realizes he can write for Hollywood without losing his identity to it. He realizes that that he has made it as a writer, as someone whose work is read by successive generations of school children and young adults and old people. It doesn't matter. There's universal meaning and resonance in so many of his stories. And so he's writing less edgy fiction. The American Gothic slowly leaves his canon over time, and it's replaced with the story that really epitomizes what his world was all about. And that was the essential optimism that he has in life overall. Bad things happen. The 2 siblings die, one before he's even born. Or before Bradbury is even born himself, and yet he gets through the depression, he gets through all the challenges in life, and he finally writes a story in the 1980s about that fundamental spirit that you see in all of his good writing. Really, if you go through away from all the genres, it's part of all the genres, but it's a story called The Toynbee Convector.
Oh, love this story.
Yes, and we won't ruin it for the students, but it's about a man who sends a time machine or takes a time machine 100 years in the future to see if we escape all the horrors of the Cold War and starvation and climate change and all that. Are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? And he finds a positive answer in a way that shows you that Bradbury's really his central core resonates with another one of his favorite readings, which is the British historian Arnold Toynbee, hence the name, the Toynbee Convector for the machine. And it's Toynbee's whole idea of challenge and response. When a culture is challenged, it either backs up to the wall and dies, or it responds to secure its future. Challenge and response. What's the response? And Bradbury gives you a much more nuanced solution to that story than you may think if you read the Toynbee Convector. Yeah. And that transcends all of the genre work that we label him with, like American Gothic.
Absolutely. And just real quick, I do have a couple of students who are in my American Studies 101 course as well this semester, so they're getting a double dose of Dr. Ackerman. And in American Studies 101, we did read the Toynbee Convector earlier this semester. So that story will be familiar to some of the students who are watching the video this week. So I'm so glad you brought that up. I think at this point we're getting pretty small on time, so I'm going to make a last call for intellectual thoughts on Ray Bradbury and the Midwestern Gothic tradition. John, I can see you're eager to say something.
Well,
Dr.
it's something I
Tibbetts.
wanted to talk about all along, but I'll keep it short. It has to do with readership. When we read a Bradbury story, what happens to us? On Facebook, as I speak, every day there are entries of people who are writing poems and stories based on Bradbury in the Bradbury mode. And I'm wondering what's going on here. Has Bradbury's work passed into such a wide context that now it belongs to the planet and we can poach upon it in any way we wish? What happens to our own authorship if we are under such an influence from Bradbury that it's kind of taken us over? Harold Bloom talks about the anxiety of influence all over the place. When we were young, reading the stories we've been talking about this whole time, did those stories do something to us? Did it become such a part of our own cultural realization and upbringing that irrevocably we began inventing our own Bradbury? Was that an enriching experience? Or in some way, has it blocked our own self-realization of our own unique way of writing and expressing our views of the world? When does a writer become so powerful in our exposure at an early age, especially, and young readers out there, listen up. When does that become so powerful that maybe you might be wondering, where am I in all of this? Or have I now adopted the influence that these stories, so powerful as they are, have had upon us? It might be a controversial question.
Well, you're looking at a fairly devout reader response critic here, and so those questions speak to me. I don't think that's necessarily controversial. John, what do you think, Dr. Eller?
Well, and Harold Bloom is talking specifically about writers and the fact that so many writers, especially early in life, have that anxiety of influence where they say, "Oh my God, this masterpiece I read and that inspired me. Am I accidentally going to pull some of his stuff into my writing? Am I going to end up being derivative in my writing? Ooh, that's anxiety causing, you see." So it's valid, and I like the way that John has spread that out or to the whole cultural awareness we get through reading as well. So yeah, I think that was a good way to sum it all up. I will only add though that since Ray Bradbury rewrote his work so much, be careful and make sure you're reading a version of the Homecoming that does not have two paragraphs, 2 pages actually accidentally transposed in it. And I'll let you and Professor Ackerman solve that mystery as the semester progresses.
They are not reading that version, actually. They are looking at the Mademoiselle copy. They're looking at a PDF of that. So that's how I distributed Homecoming to them this time. So those
Okay,
those editing errors, yeah, that was fascinating. I don't know why I didn't catch it when I read it, but I still remember I was doing a directed readings on Ray Bradbury with Dr. Jonathan Eller here, my very first semester. This is fall 2017 as a PhD student, and I just read October Country, and yeah, lo and behold, there's something about a mouse that makes absolutely no sense. But if you flip a couple paragraphs around, you realize whoever printed this got these paragraphs out of
it's
order.
at the yeah, it's a homecoming party itself, and it was very cleverly covered up by editors who came across it later and thought, well, let's just add a little bit of punctuation here and there, and nobody will notice. And there are readers whom I've heard say, "Oh yeah, it's really kind of a postmodernist story, a little bit of stream of consciousness in there." But no,
What version are you
no,
talking? When did this happen?
it happened in the October Country, and it was there forever.
Gosh.
It's still there, right? They never got
Well, let
that.
me just append.
They're in the process of correcting it just this year.
Let me
Okay.
just append to my last comment. When I go back through the journals that I've kept all my life, and I'm going back into 63 and 64, not only am I quoting these passages I love from Bradbury, but I'm writing commentaries on them in which I sound like Bradbury.
Hmm.
And this kind of frightens me a little bit. I treasure the influence Bradbury has obviously had on me in terms of awareness and writing style and all that. But I wonder, did I lose something in that process? What writer would I be had I never read Bradbury? Is that a weird question?
Well,
No.
no, if you're a neo-romantic like Bradbury would be, I think that us neo-romantic, you're a richer writer for that experience.
Yeah, but when
Great.
Walt Disney in Fantasia shows us dinosaurs to the music of Stravinsky, the people who first encounter that music will always see dinosaurs. Those people should have had a chance to hear Stravinsky without the dinosaurs, so they could make up their own minds what that music was about.
But Fantasia as a film is probably one of the great films of the 20th century. Huge influence, reissues all the time. Ray's favorite movies in Hollywood, the short answer from him would always be Fantasia and Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
But I insist, if we had had a chance to listen to the Stravinsky, we would have come up with our own images, associations, feelings. But
Of
we're
course.
denied that because if you saw only Fantasia, you're stuck with that image.
Well,
There's something wrong with that.
Oh, sure. It's hard to name two influences on our imagination than Walt Disney and Ray Bradbury, right?
No.
For better or
did they
for worse.
collaborate?
I think it's for better.
I think I'm with you, John. Eller, I think I'm more with Eller, though I do understand what you're saying, Dr. Tibbetts. And so let me just bring this to a close. And I just want to explicate to students why I'm so glad that Dr. Eller and Dr. Tibbetts were willing to do for us today, because both of you knew and loved Ray Bradbury, and he loved you back. So you've got Bradbury, the godfather, in my opinion, of the Midwestern Gothic tradition. And you've got his intellectual children here. And I have had the great fortune of learning and studying, and with Dr. Eller basically apprenticing under you. I have the great honor of directing the Bradbury Center now. So you guys are interacting with your intellectual grandchildren through this video, and Ray Bradbury's great intellectual grandchildren and the students who are studying him this week. So I just want to say thank you so much. This was a wonderful treat. You are two amazing, brilliant human beings, and my students are so fortunate we're all fortunate to learn from you. So thank you all so much.
Our pleasure.
Indeed.
All right.